My name is Dave Peeler. I am currently retired. I worked for the state of Washington Department of Ecology for 33 years and retired from there, and then went on to do some other work for several years for different organizations, and then retired 3 years ago and live here in Olympia. I've got involved in the estuary restoration efforts. When I was growing up, my family spent a lot of time on the water, on lakes and on Puget Sound, fishing, boating, camping, those kinds of things, hiking. And I always very much enjoyed that. And when I worked for the Department of Ecology all those years, I worked on water quality restoration activities across the state. And I began to see how difficult it is to accomplish these major restoration projects and how hard it is, especially for environmental groups with very little funding, to be heard and be seen and be taken seriously in these processes. And when I retired, I felt as part of my duty was to give back to what I could to protect the environment here in Washington State, including this estuary in Olympia, which is in our state capital, in our back door, as it were, which I believe really needs to be restored. I think the estuary should be restored for several reasons. One of them is, of course, Native American rights. When the treaties were signed in the 1800s, they were totally ignored for 100 years or more by our state and by the federal government, including the construction of the dam across the Deschutes River to form this lake called Capitol Lake, which cut off the estuary and changed the character of the estuary immensely, and also made it pretty much unusable for the tribes for their historic purposes of shellfish and fishing. And at the same time, I just bridle a bit at the hubris of the designers who thought they knew better than nature. We'll take this river and we will dam it and we will create this reflecting pool for the state capitol, which was their vision as landscapers and architects. But they were not ecologists. They were not hydrogeologists. They didn't know really what they were doing to the ecosystem here. And we know now, so many years later, that it's pretty much a disaster for the ecosystem. And it's really not very useful as a reflecting pool. So, I think for those reasons, it ought to be restored. I do think there are people who are currently depending on the dam being in place, mostly the Port of Olympia and some marinas and a few other folks that have depended on that for 70 years as far as reducing their need to dredge their areas. And so that's an economic issue for them. And I do think that the state and the federal government can work with them to lessen and mitigate those economic impacts that would occur to them if the estuary is restored. So they have an economic argument, and I think it's a valid one that needs to be listened to. So that's some of the interest, but I think the far greater interest falls for the ecosystem and for the Native Americans. I think it really only falls into those 2 or 3 areas. The sort of the people who really enjoy the idea of the reflecting pool for the state capitol building, and then so the historic nature of that for us European settlers that came long after the tribe had used this area for thousands of years, and then there's the economic argument of which if we take the dam out and have to build a new bridge across to West Olympia, it's going to be expensive. There's no question about that. And it's going to change the nature of the sedimentation in the Bud Inlet, and as I mentioned already, that might affect the need for dredging by the Port of Olympia and by the marinas that are downstream from where the current dam is. And so there's an economic issue for them to survive. I look at it this way. We have ports in every major bay and estuary in Washington State. This is the only one that has a dam at the mouth of the river that feeds that bay or estuary, and we have marinas and ports in every one of those places, and they manage to survive economically. So I think it can happen here. I do think there's a transition that the state can help with to make sure that it happens in a way that they don't incur really large expenses right off the bat. And there are ways to mitigate the amount of sedimentation that might fall on their properties to begin with, and I'm hoping that the environmental impact statement will be able to really look into detail at those alternatives that we've suggested. I think that humans owe a great deal to a natural environment. We grew up in a natural environment. I spent as a youth and as a young person and throughout my life a lot of hours, many days and weeks, hiking, boating, fishing, doing all kinds of things along the water, near the water, and that's where most humans like to be, is near the water. And yet we've managed to foul our nests in so many ways with pollution and with dams and different and seawalls and all the things that are very adverse to the environment. And I just think that we owe it to ourselves and to our great-grandchildren and the seventh generation, as Native Americans would say, to restore as much of that as we can so we can pass it on in a better shape than when we found it. And I was so inspired. I went to work for the state in the 1970s after I graduated from college, and that was when our major environmental laws were passed both at the state and federal level, and we have made great progress in many areas over those intervening decades, especially in regards to water pollution. But we have also continued to make a lot of damage, incur a lot of damages to the environment. A lot of it just because there's so many more of us now, population-wise. We're increasing the pressure on the environment, both in terms of use of resources and also our waste habits. And looking down the road, in order for our species to survive and for the environment to be healthy, we're going to have to do much better than we're doing now. And in fact, all the gains we've made, if we don't continue to make further gains, we fall backwards just because of the increased population and so on. And so I really think that in my position as a retiree after working in environmental issues for 40 plus years, I'm in a good position to give all I can, as long as I can, to help make that happen, and that's what I intend to do. Yeah, it's hard to know if you can please everyone in a situation like this. There are different alternatives on the table that the state is going to be looking at as they develop their environmental impact statement. And if you're trying to please everyone, there is at least one alternative that might do that to some extent, and that's what they call it the hybrid alternative, where you still keep a little bit of the lake in a freshwater condition on the east side of the lake, what's now the lake, and the rest of it gets restored as an estuary. And I'm not opposed to that. I think it is the most expensive alternative. It's been shown to be that twice now. And it's also, I think, difficult to achieve technically just because of trying to build something like that and make it function in a way that actually serves the purpose of a freshwater pond, or if you will, or pool that's left behind that actually has clean water in it that people can recreate on, but also then serves that reflecting pool idea that so many people like and enjoy. And the rest of it, my vision is that if whatever part of the estuary we can restore, we should restore and allow people to recreate on it again by kayaking or boating or fishing or that sort of thing. And that all used to happen before the dam was built. It was a tremendous recreational area for fishermen primarily. It's just a shame that we've lost all that, and we need to try to get it back. Of course, the organization that I'm on the board of for the Deschutes Estuary Restoration Team is really, that's our mission, is all about restoring the estuary, and people can become involved in our organization and help us through that. We have a lot of activities, and we invite people to comment and come participate in the various things that are going on related to the idea of restoring the estuary. Currently, there is an environmental impact statement process just starting up by the Department of Enterprise Services, which is the state agency that manages the state capital as well as Capitol Lake. And they're looking at these alternatives that I just mentioned: restoring the estuary, keeping it as a lake, creating a hybrid, or no action, which essentially means let the lake fill in and become a wetland. Anyway, they are in a comment process right now as we speak to take comments on the scoping of that EIS. And of course, later on, there'll be opportunities to comment on a draft EIS before it becomes final. And the Department of Enterprise Services also has, I was going to say regular meetings, but I don't know how regular they're going to be. They have an executive task force and a technical committee that meet. Those meetings are open to the public, and usually the department allows people to comment either at those meetings, at the end of them, or in a comment process afterwards. And so there's different ways to get involved, and certainly the Deschutes Estuary Restoration Team, through our email listservs and our Facebook pages and other ways, we'll be letting people know when those opportunities arise so that they're aware of them.